Good morning, everyone. I call Committee of Supply Section A to order. We're meeting today to continue consideration of estimates of the Ministry of Health. I now recognize the Minister to move the vote.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. I move that vote number 32 resolve that a sum not exceeding $28,526,258,000 be granted to His Majesty to defray the expenses of Ministry of Health, Ministry Operations to 31st March 2024. Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. With your permission, I'll just continue because we left yesterday afternoon with a question by the member from Prince George Aylmont. And I just wanted to give some context to that question, which may frame the debate for this morning's session. I'll just say the member was asking about the capital funding envelope for long-term care. And as the member knows, I talked about this last year, I believe, that the capital funding envelope for long-term care renewal and expansion was notionally approved at $1.3 billion. We talked about that last year. This envelope has increased as part of this budget to over $2 billion, $2,039 million to be exact, so just over $2 billion. The member will see in the projects over $50 million, two projects that were announced, the Western Communities Project, which is $224 million, $157 million of which is provincial funding. We'll know that outside of the Translink area that funding is shared. And the St. Vincent's Heather Care Home in Vancouver, which is owned by Providence Healthcare, but is integrated into our healthcare system, which is $207 million, which is all provincial funding. So of that $2 billion, you're looking at that, those two projects have been allocated. I would expect in the few weeks to follow us now, a significant number of allocation announcements to be made. So that number is $364 million. Just say, and I said this yesterday, by comparison, from fiscal year 2009-10 to fiscal year 2016-17, the total provincial capital investment in health authority-owned long-term care, which includes Providence, was $17.6 million, not billion, $17.6 million. And you know, I just want to put in context why it's important, and I'll get to the other numbers that the member asked for as well. That we see issues such as multi-bed rooms. I think the member indicated she'd be asking about that, so I won't get into that now, but that's a significant goal and priority. But if you look at the 127 long-term care buildings that are owned by health authorities, 45 of them were built before 1980. 17 were built prior to 1970, which makes them at least 53 years old. And that the aggregate facility condition index, I talked about this yesterday in response to the honourable member's question. I think I was talking about my challenge in understanding facility condition index, but just so that people watching us know that an excellent score is basically 0, the best possible score is 0, and the worst possible score is 1 under that, and that the facility condition indexes are very poor in a significant number of these cases. In fact, 47 of our health authority owned and operated care homes have a facility condition index that's in the very poor category. So I'd make 2 points. First, that the need to respond and to move forward. $2 billion is a lot of money, of course, and we will need to invest that and more in the future to address this situation, but also to address existing demand. We currently have, and this only includes St. Vincent's and Colwood, those two projects, the West Shore projects. We currently have 18 projects in flight right now, 12 under construction, 6 in pre-construction. And these projects, the member I think asked for the detail on this about what's replacement and what's incremental on those projects. 1,257 replace old and outdated beds. If you look at that number, 1,210 are net new beds, of which 1,155 are public beds. So if you, because sometimes when we have contracted processes, there's a small number of beds that are reserved as private beds, and that has typically been the case in the way we develop those projects. So when we add those numbers, that only includes the 2 projects I talked about. So incremental to that will be the remaining roughly $1.6 billion in spending, which will be in addition to those 2,467 incremental beds. I think it's fair to say, and this is, I guess, the political part of it, that, and we got this yesterday, the members from Peace River North and from East Kootenay and from Delta talked about Health Authority owned and operated projects that required either replacement or addition and so on, and that's true. But I would say that I think it's fair to say that people were let down in the period after 2009, and it hasn't picked up sufficiently in my period so that we understand we have responsibility. I mean, if you're spending almost nothing on long-term care capital, when you have facility condition index and long-standing capital infrastructure like that, as occurred between 09 and 17, and then we picked it up somewhat, but still not enough to match that demand in the interim period, you're going to have a significant list of projects, including in Fort St. John, including in Quesnel, including in Cranbrook, including in Delta, issues, because I'm anticipating my friend from Caribou North asking me about Dunroven Lodge, but maybe I'm anticipating too much. Now you will, but people should know whether she does or not. That's a subject that she and I discuss on a regular basis. So that failure to invest in the past has led to that infrastructure issue, and there's very significant demand, as the member highlighted yesterday, an increasing population of seniors and others who need long-term care.
Thank you, Minister. Now I recognize member for Prince George Falmouth.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the minister's answer. I'm hoping that we can find a way to work our way perhaps a bit more succinctly through these questions. That was 12 minutes, and every 12 minutes counts. And I will also resist the temptation I have to be partisan. That is, we've just been through the most partisan part of the day, and I don't want to start there in estimates. What I do know is this, and the context of the question was that we need 10,000 long-term care beds in the next decade. And so what I've asked the minister to do for me, and I hear the details around this project and that project, can the minister provide for me a plan that indicates how we are going to get 10,000 long-term care beds in the next decade? Is there a plan that can tell me what region, how many beds, what the need is, and what's going to be spent on them?
Minister.
In terms of the 10-year capital plan, I told the minister, the member was, that we've added to that long-term care capital plan, because at our last discussion, I think the number was $1.3 billion. So we've added it. It's now $2 billion and 64, or $2 billion, I think, and $39 million. Let me just, yes, $2 billion and $39 million. So that is a significant increase. It's not, of course, the only way that we increase the long-term care capital, and some of that will be for the replacement of existing beds. So what we've gone is from not having a long-term care capital plan to having one that sees an unprecedented investment. And so that is the Health Authority owned and operated side of the plan. As part of our senior strategy in a broad sense, we have other elements that include working with private, both not-for-profit and for-profit providers to increase capacity in those places. Also recognizing that some of the FCI in those facilities requires action as well. And in addition, of course, significant investment in home and community care, because I don't think there will be a debate from different people about how many beds we need. But from my perspective, in the immediate, we need more. And that's why thousands of beds are under construction. And through the $2 billion that has been allocated in this 2023 budget, many more will be as well. And so in terms of the numbers of those beds, the member can expect to see those projects announced And that number, which is currently 2,467, remember, those are under construction now, will be added to significantly.
Member.
Thank you. And again, to the minister, it's a very straightforward question. I understand that there are projects here, and this has been announced. In fact, the minister committed to 2,400 beds that have been approved to date. I have been unable to figure out how many have been announced and where they all are. The question, we have the Seniors Advocates report is excellent in pointing out that people in British Columbia are relatively healthy until they're 80 years old, and then the need increases incrementally. And the comment in her latest monitoring report is we've not yet begun to feel the pressure of that aging demographic. So surely to goodness, the health ministry has a plan that is a document that says we need 10,000 beds. Conference Board of Canada, BC Care providers, everyone looking at those numbers agrees that we need 10,000 beds over the next decade. Is there a plan, a document, a piece of paper that says, here's how many we need, here's how much money? Investments are appreciated, but they have to be attached to a strategic plan that give British Columbians confidence that somehow seniors in this province are going to have a long-term care bed when they need it. Is there an overarching plan the minister can table with me today?
Minister.
Thank you very much. So in response to the first question, because I think it's a good one, I'm going to do this really quickly, but the member asked for this. Like, what are the projects I'm talking about? There are 18 projects currently in flight. This isn't a plan. These are happening right now. And I'll share this with the members and have to, write it down and everything else. That 12 are under construction, 6 are under pre-construction. They're in that list, and this doesn't include the vast majority of the $2 billion plan that we have. There are the following HA capital projects. That's West Shore, which is Colwood. I referred to that before. St. Vincent's Heather. That's Vancouver. Dogwood Lodge, which is in Vancouver. 2 are with contracted partners that own the land, but we're the tenant. And that's the project in Nelson, which is part of the 495-bed initiative with Interior Health, and then the Chenchin Sway project in Burnaby, which people will remember is the New Vista project. So we supported New Vista in building a new nonprofit project there, and we're using the existing site. 6 are with contracted nonprofit partners, 6 are with contracted for-profit partners, and the one in Penticton is searching for land, and the contracted partner is to be determined. So those are those beds, and those the 2,467. So that doesn't include the vast majority of the investment that we're now making in the next in this year's budget, which is a $2 billion net, $2 billion and $39 million investment. So obviously, that's a plan to significantly address issues of declining facility condition in long-term care and to increase the number of beds. And that's what we're expecting to do. And as we lay that out, really in the next few weeks, the member will see that. And so we also have a senior strategy, which has been subject to very significant investment. We've already talked about some of that. I won't give a long description of that because we've already talked about it, that we've laid out. And this is a significant component of that, meaning that we've gone from a period where we spend nothing on long-term care to a period where we're spending dramatically in long-term care. The member is right that that there will be more demand for long-term care in the next decade than is currently funded in this budget. It will require further lifts in further years and increases in investments to reach those goals. But this is a substantial, breathtaking sea change in the way that we deal with long-term care. It reflects a strategy that says we've got to address single bedrooms, we've got to address the facility condition index, and when we do that, we have to increase bed capacity because we have to do all three things.
Member.
Well, thank you to the minister. And, the bottom line is we need to see an overarching plan that looks at a strategy to get to 10,000 additional new beds, not replacement beds, because we know the demand is coming. So we'll continue to look at those numbers, and we'll certainly have additional questions in the future to the minister, but I need to move on. I wanted to just back up for one moment. I won't ask for the answer, but I'm just going to put it on the record. The minister yesterday referenced a long-term care monitoring tool which had been created in order to deal with the new funding formula. We have yet to been able to verify that it's actually in use. The minister said yesterday it was, so I'd like the minister, if he could at some point during the day, to come back and let me know where it's in use, because we're certainly hearing from people in the provider world that is actually not the case. So if we could go back to that at some point. I do want to move on, though, and I want to get to the issue of multi-bed rooms. The election promise made by this government was to eliminate multi-bed rooms in health authority-owned long-term care facilities, giving seniors more dignity. Obviously, we agree that that's important. We also saw the impacts of multi-bed rooms during the pandemic. So I'm wondering if the minister can give me an update. That was in 2022. So I'm wondering if I could get specific answers to these questions. Has the scoping of the work been completed? And has any preliminary work been done to determine whether there is additional funding that's going to be required? Just a status update on the promise made to eliminate multi-bed rooms.
Minister.
Thank you. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just take the member through where we sit right now, so we have a common understanding of where we are. In terms of rooms in British Columbia and multi-bed rooms, the vast majority of rooms, of course, are single bedrooms in our province, single occupancy rooms. If you look that province-wide, that number was 87% in 2018, essentially in the start of this period of government, and has increased now to 90.3%. So we were 12% short. We reduced that by 25% of that 12%, 3% of the 12%. That's the progress we've made in terms of single occupancy rooms. But as everyone knows who understands the meaning of single occupancy room, that means that we've gone from about 72% of people living in single occupancy rooms, because obviously if you're in a single occupancy, a multi-bed room, a 4 or 6 bed room, then that obviously accounts for more people per room, obviously. So that's the reason for the difference between those numbers. So we're making progress, and we've made significant investments. One, the Chench and Sway project, which is at New Vista, the intent of that is to reduce at a number of other facilities where there's very high numbers of multi-bed rooms, and some of which face very challenging periods during the pandemic, including long-term care sites like Mount St. Joseph's and others, which had a lot of multi-bed rooms, to use those new beds to deal with the multi-bedroom issue. And that's what we've been doing there. Just to put that in context, if you look at the rooms now, as I said, 90.3% of the rooms are single occupancy, 6.6% of the rooms are double occupancy, 3.1% of all rooms are multi-bed occupancy, and both those have been reduced. The multi-bed occupancy from 4% to 3%, the double occupancy rooms from 8.3% to 6.6% in that period, and they've been reduced in every single year. So one of the goals of the major capital investment that we're seeing is to take that action. The member will see that a significant number of those are replacement rooms, and the approach is to, when we replace rooms in a facility, and typically our older facilities have more multi-bed rooms because of the nature of long-term care at that time in the late 60s, those that are built in the 60s, those built in the 70s, those built in the 80s. So as we replace them, we're going to see that number continue to reduce, and we're taking action now on specific sites to reduce the number of multi-bedrooms now. The New Vista Chench and Sway project was an innovative one of health authorities who came together, including Providence Healthcare, but Fraser and Vancouver Coastal Health, to do just that. the care home would move from one facility to another. And in COVID, we made the decision to maintain the existing facility and then use those rooms upgraded once the move had been made to the new Vista. So that's an example of the work we're doing. So we've made, I think, progress year into year, and we're going to make progress year into year to address that. And that single bedrooms, facility condition index, and of course the need for new beds are the three of the significant considerations when we're making decisions about healthcare capital, including the projects mentioned by honourable members yesterday.
Member.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. Well, I just, and I know I don't need to remind the Minister, but I will, that was a very specific promise made in 2020, that the beds would be, that multi-bedrooms would be eliminated. It wasn't, we're going to make progress. It was, we're going to be eliminated. They are going to be eliminated. So, and it also raises the issue, and I don't have time to debate that at the moment, but what's critical about the 10,000 beds we need, those are incremental new capacity. So when you think about using a replacement bed to take care of a promise related to multi-bed rooms, we need to make sure that we're adding incrementally 10,000 to get to 10,000 beds. So it's not as simple as we're going to replace multi-bed rooms and we're going to use replacement beds for that. We have a big challenge in long-term care. We have an aging demographic that actually need to be treated with respect and dignity, and we need to, and we raised this issue yesterday in terms of alternate level care patients. And again, I would very much appreciate the specific information that the minister has about, 23 days in terms of an alternate level care patient getting a long-term care, but that is not at all what we are hearing on the ground. We are hearing that there are potentially months, if not longer, that alternate level care patients are staying in hospitals because there is nowhere else for them to go. So complex issues, certainly numbers require significant action, and I appreciate the minister's comments on investments that are being made, but we need to see a plan that has an end point to the promise made by the government in 2020 to eliminate multi-bed rooms, and also a plan that says we understand that we need 10,000 net new beds over the next decade. And I think British Columbians would expect there to be a systematic, thoughtful, laid out plan that would demonstrate where, when, how many those beds, where they're coming. So I appreciate knowing that the investment has gone up, but we certainly want to see those plans articulated. I'm going to move on to seismic upgrades because those are also important. The ministry's own information talks about overall infrastructure in the seniors care sector, and it basically says that 63% of non-government care homes needed to be renovated and 10.5% of non-government care homes needing to be rebuilt. So can the minister tell me what work has been done to assess the need for seismic upgrades in seniors' homes?
Minister.
There's a couple of indexes that to talk about. One is the facilities condition index, which is we've talked about already, which I've described, and I've described the impact of that on investment and why there needs to be that investment. There's also a seismic priority index, but member is correct, we don't have a separate program for seismic than facility condition index. Education has that approach, as the member will know, in their projects. We don't have that separately. It's considered as we address our overall capital plan for long-term care. So those are among the considerations, facility condition index and the seismic priority index, when those decisions are made. It is somewhat more challenging, I would say, and that's why typically when we're dealing with seismic issues, we're replacing an existing care facility and then transferring. We've had a case in BC, essentially in long-term care. We keep our long-term care homes at 100% capacity or close to that, as the member would imagine. So there's not a case of transferring patients from one facility to another and then making internal fixes to a project. Typically what we do when we're dealing with seismic is we have a list of projects from the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s that were built, and we need to replace them. So we do have those index, and seismic is a consideration, but in terms of our long-term capital plan, that's one project. We also are working with the sector, both in small ways and big ways, so the BC care providers, and we haven't announced it yet, but we're their program to make minor improvements is being supported and continuing to be supported. It was started under the previous government, I think, in 2016-17. And as a happy coincidence, and it truly is a coincidence, a good thing, the member will know that the present CEO of the care providers was the Minister of Health when the program was created, and that is being extended and supported. So that's in terms of dealing with seismic issues on both sides. Those are a consideration, but they're considered with the facility condition index as described before.
Member.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the minister's answers. I want to spend a couple of minutes on the Facility Conditions Index, fondly known as FCI. And in fact, when you look at the list of long-term care facilities, 38 long-term care facilities in BC have a Facilities Condition Index of 0.6 or higher. And if you include all facilities over 0.5, that's another 28 facilities for a total of 66 facilities for which the repair cost is 50% of the replacement cost. So now, if we want to use a controversial comparison, but we will use it, when we were looking at the Royal BC Museum, the government said that it was necessary to do a complete teardown when the FCI was 0.35. And we have 66, at least 66 facilities, long-term care facilities for which the repair cost is 50% of the replacement cost. So can the minister tell me whether or not an assessment of all long-term care facilities that have an FCI ratio over 0.5 and greater has been completed, and what is the estimated cost to replace those facilities?
Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. And yes, we've done an FCI analysis of all the facilities. I think the member may have older data. I think when I was listing off the numbers, I think it was actually higher that are 0.6 or higher. I have 47 buildings, not 38, just so the member will know that. And as I noted, if you look at and to understand why that would be the case, people would say, well, what's happening with those buildings? The average age of health authority-owned long-term care homes is 37 years. Right? And so we've had this discussion, I've made this point about the lack of investment in the past not having been a good thing. And that's not just one government, by the way, that's others, right? But this was an issue, the determination was made, and it was a public policy determination to focus on new builds in the contracted sector. That was the determination. And now we're dealing with a significant issue. So if you look at just these issues, so in every case, that analysis is done. And just so everyone understands, it's 0.6 is very poor, 0.3 to 0.6 is poor. And so that's why the discussion of the Royal BC Museum was what it was. The situation, I should say, is not dissimilar, and we do this work in support of our nonprofit partners, for example, who tend to have older facilities. The for-profit sector has grown in the last number of years, but there are, just to look at the 90 licensed facilities owned by nonprofit partners. This is beyond the description I gave. 42 opened prior to 2000. 32 open prior to 1990, 15 open prior to 1980, which means they're at least 40 years old. So this is not just an issue with the health authority owned and operated. It's also an issue for a significant number of care homes in our nonprofit sector who will require a significant investment in the coming years on the existing capacity. I agree with the member. That means that you have to look at those elements of replacing existing buildings or upgrading, but probably replacing many of those existing buildings, especially the ones built prior to 1980. And while you're doing that, increasing capacity. So the member is right in that respect. There's a detailed response on FCI, which I'm going to save the member about how one calculates these things. But just to say that detailed analysis is made in every case. Part of the challenge, and this is especially true why someone asked yesterday about why we're doing Colwood as opposed to something else. Since in the last 23 years, there have been 3 new HA facilities opened on Island Health for a total of 231 beds. And as the member says, that's not going to get it done over time, and it puts us more in deficit in terms of the replacement beds we have to do. And you see in the numbers I gave to the member how significant that number is as a share of the beds that we're building now.
Member.
Thank you very much, and the minister's correct. The list that I have as a result of an extremely long wait for FOI was May of 2022. So happy to have refreshed information from the minister rather than wait an eternity through FOI. I'm wondering if the minister could tell me if, when we look at FCI, we look at the condition of long-term care facilities, every year that we defer a replacement plan, does the ministry look at what the increased cost of that deferment would be?
Minister.
I think 2 things. There's always cost escalations for the projects themselves, and we've seen that dramatically in the last number of years, and we'll be having, I'm sure, further discussions of that when we talk about the overall capital plan of health. But I think it's fair to say that now decades of deferments have increased the cost significantly, and that is a consideration. It's why we have to act and why we are acting, and you're going to, and members are going to see, and I work, as you know, with members across the legislature who are advocates for these projects, and so we're going to see them together. In some cases, the changes we've made. But what I can say is that it won't be. It's not enough in the sense that we're not responding in every single case where it needs required, even within a $2 billion, $39 million budget. So yes, when you defer, it costs more because there's cost escalation, and because and principally because there's cost escalation in the construction, because some of our most challenged buildings, if you can think for your members from Kelowna, Cottonwoods, for example, some of our most challenged buildings, are not really upgradable in the sense they need to be essentially replaced, and so the increase in cost is the cost escalation. But there's the further question right, which is the cost for those living in long-term care who only live a relatively shorter period in long-term care because of the circumstances of their health. And so they're living in those facilities now. And so there's cost for them that we don't measure in these terms, but it's still significant.
Member.
Thank you, and I certainly recognize that deferral of a project likely means escalation in cost. My point was that as we look at at facilities and look at the ratings, there comes a point where you have to balance, and I didn't mean that. It has to be, wasn't directly to the minister. There is that balance in terms of deciding when you're actually going to make a decision to replace versus continuing deferral because of the increase in costs. So I'm assuming the ministry monitors that carefully and then makes a decision about when to move from deferral to actually replacing. And I think it's just important that we have on the record the fact that there are a significant number of long-term care facilities that are at the point where it is 50-50 in terms of repair or replacement. And that's an important consideration in the overarching look at capacity. So I want to move on to healthcare standards and basically direct care hours. But I want to just, articulate my significant concern about the lack of capacity that we have to manage the aging demographic. And one of the things we can be very grateful for is that there's a very healthy population in British Columbia. Most seniors prefer to live in community wherever possible. We're going to get to home care in a moment in terms of how we support people staying in community. But we have a big challenge ahead of us. Whatever government has to face that. At least 10,000 beds are required. That is new. It is not replacement. It isn't, making sure we have fewer multi-bed rooms. We have a big challenge ahead of us. So in addition to that, we have to talk about how we care for seniors. I know this government has increased the hours of care, but the new national standard, while it is not prescriptive, we've had this discussion already, they actually use as an example a minimum level of acceptable care. Looking at a number of studies is actually, they cite the number 4.1 hours. We've seen the Ontario government is increasing the hours of direct care to an average of 4 hours per resident. The government of Alberta is recommending up to 4.5 hours over 4 years. They're going to make that transition. Currently, and the minister can correct me if I'm incorrect, but BC currently looks at an average of 3.36 hours of care when you include allied health. So one of my concerns is that there's no longer a performance measure in the service plan to demonstrate where the government intends to go on hours of care. So last year, the service plan showed the ministry's intent was to hold at 3.36 hours of direct care through to 2024-2025. So can the minister speak to what the government's intention is when it comes to how we line up against other provinces? We are seeing significant movement in other provinces, and I'm wondering what the plan is in British Columbia to move beyond the 3.36 hours of care per day.
Member.
With the minister's indulgence, we can come back to direct hours of care. I have a colleague that has one question related to infrastructure, and we aren't going to have the opportunity to go back there. So if I could ask the minister to recognize my colleague for one question, and then after the break, we can come back to direct care.
My apologies.
Thank you.
Recognizing the member from West Vancouver Sea to Sky.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to my colleague for allowing me to ask a question. I'm sure the minister is familiar with the with the situation in West Vancouver where we've lost several hundred long-term care beds over the last number of years. There's a proposal from the nonprofit Baptist Housing Society from the Inglewood Care Facility to significantly expand that facility, which is over 60 years old at this point, with I think 230 beds, mostly multi-bed rooms, I believe. And it's really time to upgrade this facility. And given that we've lost so many beds on the North Shore, or certainly in the West Vancouver side, could the minister help me understand what government's commitment is to that proposal at this point, if any?
Minister.
Thank you, and thank you, Honourable Chair, for that. And to say that it is, I think, a high priority project, a project that we support strongly. What they're seeing, I think, and you know, I don't want, because it's their, in some ways, their business, and what they're working for. What they're seeing is the kind of escalation in capital costs that we're seeing elsewhere. And we're working with them, Vancouver Coastal Health's working with them on that. It's an important project. And obviously we have other projects and work in mind on the North Shore broadly from across the communities, because there is an increasing seniors population, increasing need for that care. And in any event, as we've been discussing here, we need not to lose beds when we're trying to gain beds, and to replace beds that are too old, as is the case at Inglewood. So it's a project we support. It's a project that's going forward, we believe. And the issue, but I think the issue there is the proponents of the project dealing with the same thing that, in fact, health authorities are seeing, which is significant increased costs. But just to be clear that we're working with them on that and continue to be, and we're hopeful that we get those beds built, because we need to get them built at Inglewood. So I want to thank the member for his questions. Briefly, just to say on the 3.36, we went to 3.51 this year, so we exceeded that target. And what I'd commit to do is simply, sometimes the targets in the service plan, part of the reason why that target was not put in the service plan. We want to bring in some other targets which are helpful to the public to look at progress at issues. We had driven that project to achieve the goal that we want to achieve, which was the government's 3.36 commitment, which had been made in 2007 or 2008. We want to make that. We made a major effort. We funded it. We've talked about it in multiple estimates. So part of the reason it came down from that, but what I'd commit to the member to do is simply to provide of those targets that are not in the service plan to provide that information, so that the opposition and everyone else continues to have that. The intention was not to remove that, for it not to be assessed. It's just that we had met our target in that case, and so continuing to talk about it as an aspiration to get better when it wasn't an aspiration necessarily, was the reason we made that decision, but that's easily done. We're at 3.51 this year. I think the member has rightly identified, and we're certainly looking at that as we look at the discussion with standards, looking at what other jurisdictions are doing. Just to put it in context, I think it was in the neighborhood, I'll have to get the numbers, $250 million to go from 3.11 to 3.36. That was the estimated thing. We've gone beyond that. The reason we've gone beyond that is the success of the HCAP program. But I'll have more to say for that, because I think we're past our time. Honourable Chair, and you're looking at me expectantly saying, why doesn't he just read this following motion, that the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again?
The question is that the committee rise, report progress, and seek leave to sit again. Those in favor? Aye. Oppose? Motion is carried. Thank you, members. The committee now stands adjourned.